So, what does the Radical Reformation have to do with us today? What does it mean to you? Well, in John 15:5, Christ explained that he's the vine, we're the branches. He founded a church on earth which, over time, to reach different people in different walks of life, nations, and languages, it's divided and grown into many branches, but all part of the same tree, all still the one Christian church. And one of the most substantial divisions, one of the largest limbs that grew on the tree, began in the 1500s, and we generally refer to that as the Reformation. At the time, everyone more or less agreed that things had gone wrong and required correction. They just disagreed over how to do it, what needed to be done. Within the Catholic Church, a large group said that our institutions are sound, we're just executing them badly, and we need to repair and refurbish. And they were called the Counter-Reformation. With major reformers whose names you may know, Martin Luther, John Calvin, John Knox, the Anglican Church under Henry VIII. They thought, yes, we need to keep a strong national and international church, but there are substantial changes that need to be made so that this tree can bear good fruit. And we need to prune back to the trunk and reform the structure. And then there were the radical reformers. And when we look back, we speak of them as a group because they had a lot in common, but they were actually many groups in many countries, many languages, who were all crying out together that no, we need to get back to the roots of the tree. Radical, of course, means root. It doesn't mean extreme, even though this was an extreme change. The radical reformers' goal was to return to the practices of the early church and produce new growth from the roots. For instance, they didn't want church services in Latin or any foreign language. They thought that they absolutely should be able to hear the gospel in your own language by someone in your own community, and the elders should be chosen from among your community, as they had been in the early church. Pietists, which was one of the radical reforming groups in Germany, tried to embrace all these Christian sects. They were ecumenical, and they used the language of the heart when they spoke of having a personal commitment to Christ and Christ changing your heart and knowing him personally. The gospel, as they preached it, was about you coming into relationship with Christ rather than about you joining a church and learning its rites and practices to lead you in the Christian walk. And these reformers believed in a priesthood of believers rather than local priests. The church was to the radical reformers the body of believers living out Christ's commands rather than the church being an institution that mediated the means of grace to the world. And they rediscovered language about living in close relationship with Christ. They had the same goal as the existing church, but they expressed the gospel using language that sounded very strange at the time. Today, the radical reformers' language is very, very common in America, even in the more mainstream denominations that came out of the mainstream Reformation. It was the radical reformers, for instance, who left infant baptism behind in favor of adult believers' baptism. They were called Anabaptists, meaning re-baptized, because they were baptizing one another as adults, even though they'd been baptized as infants by a priest, because they understood baptism was an expression of personally committing to Christ rather than as a sign of being born into the church community as a baby. And today, that's a pretty common understanding. In general, the radical reformers modeled their practices after the early church. They took practices and ordinances such as communion out of the hands of the priests so that the priests weren't standing between the Christians and God. And so communion became a very personal thing. Now, socially, they moved physically and ideologically away from the religious wars that they'd been living through for generations, and they pursued Christianity as a religion of peace. They distanced themselves from any commitments or any institutions or governments that conflicted with their commitment to Christ. And unlike the rest of the Reformation, the radical reformers sought to separate church from state. They saw the church as a community of local persons who would pursue Christ on their own conscience, not be controlled and enforced or mediated by a larger institution or government. And again, this seems very normal today, but that was not normal at the time. These are all aspects of church as we know it that the radical Reformation recovered from the early church and brought forward to us today. So our local church here in Winchester was born out of the radical Reformation, and specifically it was influenced by Pietism and Anabaptism, which is why we value things like the autonomy of each local church, the empowering of leaders, believers' baptism, communion as an ordinance that emphasizes both Christ's sacrifice and our obedience. And mostly, while we respect and use the insights of the great teachers who've come before us, we do not rest on their teachings. It's not a box of answers that we go back to. We actively reinvestigate the Scripture, and we seek God together as a community. We must vigilantly rediscover the Scripture each generation as a community, reforming the church as a community, so we can stay close to our roots and the model of the original church.